This year marks the 200th anniversary of the opening of the Erie Canal, the waterway that connects Lake Erie to the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. By connecting the Great Lakes and New York City, the canal helped hasten westward expansion into the Midwest and beyond, and laid the groundwork for the industrialization and development of cities throughout the Great Lakes region. Here to talk about the history and legacy of the Erie Canal is Dr. Matthew Smith, professor of history at Miami University of Ohio. He recently wrote about the canal for our friends at The Conversation. Dr. Smith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa, for having me. It's a pleasure.
So just to start us off, can you tell us why the canal was built in the first place?
So the construction of the canal was really quite a remarkable thing in the context of it really is the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution. So it was something that was, I think, 363 miles when it was finally constructed and opened in October of 1825. And before that time, the longest canal in the whole of the United States was something like 20 miles in length. So it was, more than 10 times longer than anything that has been built on that scale previous to that. And it was really, I think, the identification of a logistical challenge that faced the state of New York. So when we think of New York, of course, most people, even most Americans, tend to think of New York City. But New York City is, of course, just one small corner of the state of New York. And even to this day, the state of New York is fairly rural. But we're talking here early 19th century. This was still the American frontier. So, for example, it would have taken something like 5 to 6 weeks traveling overland to have traveled from New York City in the year 1800 and to have gone to Southwest Ohio, where I am right now.
Wow.
So you think
Wow.
about those kind of journeys. These are like epic voyages. But it meant that the integration of the American economy, especially as the American frontier was expanding even beyond Western New York State, was really kind of starting to fracture the very fabric of America. So you have this governor of New York State, DeWitt Clinton, in the early 1800s, who has the vision to build something which was not a new technology, but was new on that scale in the United States. That's to say, an artificial waterway that would have connected New York City via the Hudson River to Albany, and then by canal to Buffalo and Lake Erie. And it's that connection of the waterways. The Great Lakes, of course, as your viewers know, are central to the economy today of the United States. But connecting that to the Atlantic in the early 1800s, that was the challenge.
So would you say it was really Governor DeWitt Clinton who led the way for its construction efforts, or was he partnered with an organization? Who sort of led the way on the construction?
I do think this is one example of bold political leadership in the early 19th century. I know we tend to be cynical these days about politicians, but just to give you some indication, in the early 19th century, there was a young politician coming up through the ranks in Illinois. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Your viewers may have heard of him. And in the 1830s, I think it was, he told a friend that his goal, his dream, was to become the DeWitt Clinton of Illinois. That's how he wanted to be remembered. And now, of course, people unfortunately have forgotten about DeWitt Clinton, but everyone knows Abraham Lincoln. The point being that DeWitt Clinton was a genuine political visionary. That word is overused these days, but he was someone willing to take risks. He did have a lot of backing, obviously. He had supporters both in Congress, but also in really the early kind of iteration of what is now we would refer to as Wall Street. So investors, private finance people. But initially, what was interesting was that the canal was going to be funded by the U.S. Congress. They actually had a bill way back in 1817. This was 8 years before the eventual final construction of the Erie Canal. And U.S. Congress actually approved the funding for the Erie Canal because the representatives felt that this was kind of a moonshot for the U.S. economy. But what was interesting is the president of the United States at that time, James Madison, who we refer to now as the father of the Constitution because he was one of the key framers of that document, vetoed the bill that would have funded the Erie Canal on the grounds that it was unconstitutional in his view to fund a state project through federal finances. So what actually ended up happening was that DeWitt Clinton, who came up with the original idea, and this was his vision, but he turned to essentially private investors in his home state of New York, particularly some of the New York financiers. And it was paid for through state of New York issuing bonds. So it was a bond-funded measure in the end.
You mentioned how big of a project it was for its time in terms of scale. I guess in terms of like just sheer tools and machinery and labor, how did they pull this off at that time?
Well, what I like to tell my students as well is, the early American Industrial Revolution. We think of the Industrial Revolution as being this sort of step change in American technology, but really it was built using much the same technology as, for example, the ancient Egyptians had 4,000 years ago when they were building their canal system. So the technology itself was very old. What was new, I think, was the scale of it and the ambition. So you're talking here about really very little in the way of what we would think of as advanced technology. There was no excavation machines, even steam-powered excavation machines. There were obviously pack animals and horse-drawn carts, things of that nature. But most of the work was done by about 9,000 laborers over the course of 8 years. And it was done with shovels. It was done with human muscle. And it's also worth pointing out that 1/4 of the workers who actually constructed the canal were immigrants, actually mostly from Ireland, who had just arrived, and they were paid something in the equivalent of $1 a day for their labor, which even at that time was not a huge amount of money, but it was incredible, epic, just almost exercise of willpower and physical elbow grease, as they used to say.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, how outside of Congress and perhaps like regionally, how popular was this project? Did it have a lot of support?
It was actually surprisingly divisive, and I say surprisingly divisive because once it was up and running, it soon paid for itself, even just in toll fees. So like your viewers may be familiar with some states like Pennsylvania, where you have toll roads to this day. But that was it. The operating budget was through toll fees, and it paid itself off. I think it was about $7 million within the first couple of years in toll fees alone. But in terms of the original project, because it was so much larger than anyone had ever, attempted in the United States, and also the scale of it was seen almost as a point of hubris. There was one quote I like to give by it was actually a Quaker minister from the early 19th century, guy called Elias Hicks. And he said that if God had wanted to place internal waterways, he would have put them there. So it was seen as, almost like a defiance of God's will. But even more mainstream politicians like Thomas Jefferson, for example, and I mentioned, of course, Madison was not necessarily a fan of the way it was originally going to be funded. But Jefferson referred to it as madness. And again, part of that was, I think, the scale of the project. But part of it also, I think, maybe was a little bit of jealousy or anxiety about the rise of New York, because, of course, New York will go on in the 19th century become known as the Empire State. So you got these politicians from Virginia, which was actually the largest state of the United States at that time, which had an economy that was based on agriculture and slave agriculture at that. Looking at the rise of the Industrial Revolution in the North, and I think there was a little bit of anxiety about that kind of new model of the economy.
Yeah. So the Erie Canal didn't just move products, it moved people and ideas. And I'm wondering how it helped shape the American identity.
That's a great question as well. I think times of industrial and especially technological upheaval are also times of great cultural anxiety. And that's something that we see very much in our own time. And, just talking to my students, I always try and make these connections between the past and the present. So I'm actually a historian of religion. And one of the interesting things about the upstate New York in particular, if we're talking about upstate New York, which connected New York City ultimately to the Great Lakes, that whole region was known in the early 19th century by contemporaries, but also later by historians, as the Burnt Over District. It was called the Burnt Over District because there were a series of mostly Protestant evangelical religious revivals that took place in the early 19th century as these canal towns were filling up, as the region was being populated by immigrants. Also, I should say, as the land was being dispossessed from its native peoples. And you see this kind of cultural upheaval, and it's like the ground is being plowed up. Or the analogy that was given, it was like a burnt over district, because you have all these people who are kind of rootless, and like where you have a lot of development, you often get, sort of wildfire. And this is kind of a cultural wildfire. So you have the anxiety of the technology, the wealth that's created by the technology, but also the dispossession and the mobility of populations. And then people are looking for some kind of message or some kind of anchor in their lives, and turning to religion in many cases. So you have some of the biggest, most prominent religious figures of the 19th century that actually emerged from that very sort of concentrated region of upstate New York in the 19th century. We're talking here about people like Charles Grandison Finney, who was probably the most famous revivalist in what was known as the Great Awakening of religion during the 19th century. And he was preaching the gospel out of Rochester, New York. Rochester, incidentally, was the fastest growing city in the United States between 1825 and 1835. So it's a very interesting place. But also in that region, you have a guy called Joseph Smith, who actually founded what will later become the Church of Latter-day Saints, generally known as the Mormon movement, which was a sort of alternative religious movement that grew out of the experimentation in religion. There was a guy called William Miller who founded a movement called the Millerites, which will go on to become one of the root organizations of what is now the Seventh-day Adventists. And so you have a great deal of revival going on in that area. You also have, incidentally, the Shakers in upstate New York as well. It was founded by a woman who came from England, known as Mother Ann Lee. She came from England. She was a little bit before the Erie Canal, but she should also be recognized as part of that kind of cultural laboratory that was taking place during this period. So obviously, the significance of the canal system, the Erie Canal in particular, was more than just religion. But I think it's a kind of interesting counterpoint to the economic history, that the religion was defining the culture. And of course, a lot of the social movements of the 19th century, such as abolitionism, the women's rights movement, and other movements that we tend to forget about today, such as the temperance movement, were very concentrated as well in upstate New York, where you have these large immigrant populations, and you have people trying to reach out to those populations with these ideas that are very often kind of religious in nature.
That's so interesting because I feel like, I'm familiar with the history of Seneca Falls and the importance of that in just the abolitionist and feminist movements, but also like I'm aware of Joseph Smith, and I remember him being from somewhere in upstate New York, but I never really connected the dots that they all kind of overlap around the same time. So that's really fascinating to know that. So how would you describe the legacy of the Erie Canal?
I do think it's again, a mixed legacy. I do want to acknowledge as well the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois nations that were in upstate New York. They were removed from the land, or at least removed from the path of the canal. Now, it was not quite like in 1830 when you had the Federal American Indian Removal Act that was passed through Congress. So these were treaties that were signed with the local Indian populations that ceded the land. But nevertheless, they were quite coercive in nature. And as the course of the the development took place along the Erie Canal, of course, it also brought agricultural settlement. So a lot of the land surrounding that was then taken up by settlers. But in terms of the immediate economic impact of the canal, the travel times were slashed radically from 5 or 6 weeks to a couple of weeks to cross across the length of New York. The cost of freight went down overnight by 90%. So it creates really the economic foundations of the American Industrial Revolution. And so if you think we're now in a new industrial revolution, which I'm sure viewers will have their own views of, in terms of the legacy of technology in America, but we wouldn't be here where we are today if it wasn't for these kind of bold, big level infrastructure measures that were taking place in the early 19th century. So as I like to say, the foundations of American democracy have concrete foundations. So that's really the country we're in today is a direct result of people like DeWitt Clinton having the vision to build on the scale that they built, and everything that followed, good and bad, that came from that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, and thank you to you, Lisa, and your listeners as well. It's been a pleasure.